Especially if you're young, right? If you're fresh out of uni, you got plenty of time. If you spend a year or two working on something that you're really interested in and it doesn't work out, like it's gonna be totally doable for you to sort of get back into an industry or something, right? Maybe it's different if you're 45 and you have 3 kids or something,
And a mortgage.
and there's sort of all these external pressures. But if you're young, I reckon go for it.
All right, it'll just be part of it. All right, we'll go again. Sorry, man. Welcome to episode number 7 of Brisbane Base. Today, my guest is Dre Zhao, co-founder of Askable, the Uber for user testing, which helps companies find and book participants on demand for market research and usability testing purposes. Askable has progressed from an idea in mid-2017 to a thriving outfit with over 10 staff, 6 figures in monthly revenue, and a laundry list of prestigious clients, including Woolworths, Qantas, Domino's, Optus, and Medibank, to name but a few. Formerly, Dre also co-founded and held various director positions at Orange Digital, a multidisciplinary digital marketing agency and consulting firm, housing roughly 40 full-time employees prior to Dre's exit and generating just under $4 million in annual revenue, there or thereabouts, at the time. While at Orange, Dre was instrumental in orchestrating the Think Do initiative, originally an internal innovation facility that provided Orange Digital employees 1 paid day per week to work on their own projects, which eventually led to the birth of Askable, where we are now, which I think is super cool. And if all that wasn't enough, Dre has also co-founded Unpossibly, another innovation initiative that challenges very smart people with seemingly impossible tasks and immovable deadlines. A purebred entrepreneur and lifetime overachiever, Dre is featured in Smart Company, Indie Hackers, and Business News Australia for his achievements in business. Dre, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks. Great to be something that you.
Man, I'm stoked to have you on for a multitude of
discipline
reasons. But
to come back and just keep pushing and keep working on that thing. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think it's something that a lot of people, like, I don't necessarily feel like I've got it perfectly figured out, and I think it's part of the journey that sort of like people you go on as you get older as well. You're just trying to figure out what that is. It's tricky, yeah, and I guess that's why a lot of people sort of switch up careers halfway through.
Yeah, but I feel like they're almost searching for something, like you just kind of alluded to, that perhaps maybe doesn't even exist. Maybe it's a bit of a unicorn. Like, you're not. Like, work will sometimes, depending on occasion, feel like work,
Yeah, definitely. Like, work, sometimes things happen and things suck. Like, you just have to work through that, right? I don't think there's any magic realm where you're able to find this perfect thing that you're working on and it never sucks, right? Like, especially not in business anyway. So, yeah, I think that's just the reality.
100%. There was another quote I noticed of yours. I think I was going back through an old Orange Digital presentation you put together. A mild disrespect for change has brought many large organizations to their knees. And inherent in affecting change and driving innovation is this notion of taking risk. And I guess in light of that insight and in light of, the Elon Musk biography, which I know you really enjoyed, I'd be curious to know, what your philosophy is on taking risks and making really bold bets.
Yeah, I think if you want to start your own startup or your business, it's something that you intrinsically have to take that first step, right? There's always going to be an element of risk, especially if you want to do it full time. If it's something that you're sort of just doing off to the side as a side project. But eventually, if you really want to make it work, I don't think there's any such thing as creating a really successful business part-time. I think eventually you're going to have to sort of make a call to quit your job or quit your study or whatever it is and dive into that full. And so that has risk, right? Like, but I think overall, us in Australia, we have pretty good, I guess, safety net, you call it. So if things ended up going really, really bad, there's still a lot of opportunity in Australia, and especially if you've got a degree, right, something that you can always kind of fall back on. So I think on the whole, like, being in Australia, or I'd say it's probably similar in the US as well, that kind of the risk of you being like starving out on the street because you tried to do this thing and it didn't work out, I think would be reasonably low. So in that sense, it's kind of like, if it's not going to kill you, there's probably no need to get like overly in your head about it. And I know it'd be different for people, if they've got families with kids and, people relying on them to that level, it probably, there's an added level of pressure. But I still think like if you don't take that risk, it's a risk reward situation, right? If you don't take that risk, you're never going to get the returns that you want from that. So it's just part of the gig, right?
Yeah, Sam Altman talks about it, Naval Ravikant talks about it. In modern society, and particularly within the realm of careers in today's day and age, the downside risk is so limited and the upside feels so infinite.
Especially if you're young, right? If you're fresh out of uni, you got plenty of time. If you spend a year or two working on something that you're really interested in and it doesn't work out, like it's going to be totally doable for you to sort of get back into an industry or something, right? Maybe it's different if you're 45 and you have 3 kids or something, and a mortgage, and there's sort of all these external pressures. But if you're young, I reckon go for it.
Now's the time.
Yeah.
A close cousin of risk is regret. In life, sometimes when you don't take certain risks, or perhaps you take the drastically wrong ones, you end up with certain regrets longer term. I'd be really curious to know if there's anything you would change or wish you would have done a little differently over the course of your career, or are there any pitfalls of being hyper-focused and a high performer that are worth pointing out for anyone else who's charting a similar entrepreneurial trajectory to your own? Like, do you wish you would have worked more, worked smarter, done more things outside of work?
Yeah, a couple things. I think the thing that I guess if you're starting out on your own venture, the thing that they don't really teach and it's hard to learn, like if you want to learn programming, for example, there's plenty of material available for you to do that. The thing that I personally struggled with the most was probably the more people side of things. Really being able to figure out how to get alongside people and understand and be able to empathize with people well, especially when you're operating on your own wavelength and sort of pushing in your own lane. It can be really, like, it's not something that's easy to just read a book and suddenly you're just great with people. So that's something that I kind of regret not focusing more on early, rather than focusing sort of 100% of my time on the technical stuff. Actually spending some time and energy to stop and learn the people side of things earlier on is something that I think would have been good for me.
How might someone do that?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So, I mean, obviously mentors are a great resource. So someone who you think you look up to in that sense, and someone who's sort of lived that journey and has the experience there as a resource to go and talk to them about that. Because a lot of these people things can be quite specific. So you can't just be like, hey, how can I get better with people, right? It's often like, hey, I've got this issue that I've got with this person, and so being able to actually talk through the details with someone who's been there and done that is I think a big deal. But also I think it's a lot of like self-development as well. Learning things like humility, things like that I think are really important. So there's kind of like the external factor, but then there's also the self-development internal factor as well.
I guess there's also the case of just more iterations. Like, I guess, if you want to get better with people, a great way to do that is just to have a lot of conversations. You'll just be a better conversationalist. You'll pick up on more social nuances, etc., and you'll just get better in that dynamic.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I mean, again, you could read a book, and there's some great books out there about, how to have one-on-one interviews and how to improve your feedback skills, your ability to give people feedback, which is really counterintuitive. But if you just read the books, but then you don't actually practice doing it, then that's only half the story, right? Like, you got to actually be able to go and put those things that you've learned to use as well.
Yeah, it's a different sensation to do versus read about it. Absolutely. To switch up the pace a little bit, coming back to some of the things we were talking about initially. Once someone has that idea, I guess the next step for them is to build, whether it's a product or service oriented offering, they need to put together their MVP or minimum viable product in order to get paying users. And I guess you've done this multiple times successfully across multiple, disciplines. So I'd be really curious to know what advice you'd have for someone building an MVP, and specifically around the advantages of cultivating an action bias and shipping versus the temptation to delay and be a perfectionist.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a tricky one. I think there's no blanket advice here. I think the classic definition of MVP, just build something really crappy and launch it. It's probably too broad. I think it really depends on what kind of business you're trying to build. So you really need to go away and think about and figure out what really actually is your MVP. And I've heard some people say like minimum viable business, so MVP, not MVP, because
Right.
like you actually have to think about what you need to build to get the first version of your business up and running, right? And so it's going to look different for different things if you're a product or a service, right? But I think generally speaking, really being able to stop yourself when you feel like you've got something that you can actually get in front of someone. Because again, the risk is kind of getting too overly focused on the details. I think if you catch yourself like umming and ahhing about things like colors or
Yeah.
like there are things that obviously like you just stop, just get this in front of someone. But it is really hard for me to go, this is what an MVP is, because you need to actually see what their business is. So it's kind of like too case by case. But in our case, we launched with a landing page, right? Like we launched with a landing page and a form that basically said, book how many people you need, right? Fill this thing out.
Yeah.
And we would run around with our hair on fire in the background trying to like get this thing serviced. But again, it's going to be different for every business. It's too hard for me to go like, this is the formula for what an MVP should be.
Yeah, there's no prescription.
I don't think so, no.
Yeah. But once you do have it though, the next best thing to do is to start getting, acquiring paying users. And, ideally you can do that before, but pre-sales aren't always realistic. And one of the ways you guys went about business development, which I resonate with so deeply because it's worked so well for me throughout my career, is just the good old fashioned cold email. And anyone who's watching or listening right now is probably thinking, wait a minute, how did you know who to email? Like, how did you find their emails? Like, what's the tone of this outreach to get complete strangers to give you their money, albeit for a service that solved a pain point for them? But could you go into a little bit of detail? You've wrote a Medium post about this as well, which I'll link in the description. But what's the crux of it for those who aren't familiar? Yeah,
so I think it goes back to, again, solving your own problem, right? That's the first part. Because if you're solving your own problem, you know who to talk to. It's people like you, right? So originally when we did our first run of emails, we just emailed other agencies in Brisbane because we were like, hey, so, when I was in an agency, I had this problem. I don't know, do you have the problem too? And they would be like, yes, and so I think that's a really obvious starting point. So if you're working on your own problem, go and search people on LinkedIn with people with your same titles, right? I think the other benefit there is if you can come from an angle where it's like, hey, I had this problem. Do you have that problem too? It's so easy to get like someone to reply to you or get alongside someone because they're like, hey, that's me. Like this person who's emailing me is me.
It's relatable.
It's relatable. I think that makes the world of difference. In terms of the actual, like how you go about approaching them, we've always found that like just being personal is better than being spammy. Like it's just so common now to get your inbox just flooded daily with crap, right?
Afternoon, sir.
Absolutely, yeah. Just stuff that, you can tell that they haven't researched anything about you or they know nothing about you and they've just blasted it out to 1,000 people. But actually writing something personal and keeping it short as well, I think works really well. But nothing will beat emailing someone about something that only you would know that they have that pain point, right? And for them to go, oh, totally, like that is something that's a pain in the ass every single day. I think that's the best starting point and is probably more important than necessarily what you put in the email or whatever, right? Just having that something that's relatable that's really definitely the most important thing.
Yeah, and for all the people who are out there on the phones every day or in business development for what they do professionally, there's a tool that you did use previously called Hunter.io. I'm not sure if that still works for LinkedIn prospecting.
I think LinkedIn have changed a few things, so it doesn't work anymore exactly how we used to. It used to, but if you find someone on LinkedIn, there's just Google how to get someone's email address from a LinkedIn. There's heaps of different tools out there.
There's also a plugin called Snov.io or Snovio,
Yeah.
which I found to be pretty effective. It's actually the reason we're sitting here.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, it's a pretty good tool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, as important as business development is, it's not going to work if you only send 1 or 2 emails. I guess the key to being successful in anything is to do it, with repeatability and consistently. Productivity and high output is a subject you're really interested in and have written deeply on, once again, on Medium, which I'll link in the description. And in entrepreneurial parlance, there's talk of, the 10x engineer, someone who's literally accomplishing 10 times more than their contemporaries in the same amount of time or sometimes less. What are some, dare I say, easy or quick win productivity layups for the average person who's working a 9-to-5 job? Like, what could they consider doing today to get more out of their day?
That's a good question. I think it comes down to your ability to really focus. I've just noticed that, it's so easy these days to just get distracted by stuff. Even if you've got your phone on silent, if you're sitting in front of a computer like I do every day, it's so easy to get distracted by an email or an article or something that gets sent to you. And then you find yourself going down this rabbit hole of like reading this thing, and then you realize that you've just spent an hour doing something like that.
You're watching a cat video. Do you always end up on a cat video?
100%. And it sounds like a bit of a cop-out because it's such a simple thing, like just stay focused. But I think actually really being like in the zone focused, it's so hard to do, especially if you work in an open office. That's particularly hard to do. If you don't have noise cancelling headphones or something that can really drown out the background noise, I've noticed myself anyway, I naturally tune into other people's conversations. If they're talking about something that I think is interesting, it's just so hard for me to just stay in my zone and focus. And so I think if you can get a really good pair of noise cancelling headphones, figure out how you can stop yourself from getting distracted by Facebook or whatever it is, whatever you're the most easily distracted by, and just try and get into that zone of focus. And I think we've all been there, right? Like when you just absolutely get in that mode. I think the other thing that's really, really important, and I've talked about it elsewhere, is having deadlines for yourself. I think if you work for yourself, it's kind of like no one's breathing down your neck saying, hey, you need to get this done by this day. Or maybe you work for someone else and you've kind of got loose deadlines or whatever. I think a lot of that productivity, that urgency of getting in that zone of being like, crap, I need to get this done, comes from having that deadline. But it's going to be up to you to figure out how to make that deadline feel real. Because if you don't believe that deadline and you're just like, okay, I want to try and get this done by 11, right? But then 11 comes around and you're just like, oh yeah, whatever.
It was arbitrary, didn't matter.
Who cares? Yeah. You got to figure out ways to trick yourself into believing that, no, if I don't get it done by 11, I'm dead. Because that's where the word deadline comes from, right? Like it was literally, they used to draw a ring around the prisoners and they say, if you cross over this line, we shoot you, right?
No way.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
So I recommend people read into Parkinson's law a little bit. There's some really great stuff around sort of the power of deadlines and immovable deadlines, but sort of having that internal deadline, I think, and drowning out noise, being able to focus is probably the thing that I think would make the biggest difference for people.
The key thing, yeah. Something you wrote on Medium, which I just had to highlight, was that if you're someone who copy and paste something 40 times in a day and you save 3 seconds each time by using the hotkey function, it works out to be something like 12 hours in a year.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that's non-trivial for such a small thing. And especially when you compound that with other things in concert with that, all of a sudden you're getting back probably weeks of time, which is just phenomenal. I wanted to quickly touch on Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia from Airbnb, who I know you draw a lot of inspiration from. And when I've personally looked back on the early day stories of Airbnb, whether it's the whole Obama-O saga or them flying across the country to take professional photos of their host listings or conducting user interviews disguised as those same professional photographers, is that to get anything off the ground in the early stages, you need to get your hands dirty, you need to scale the unscalable, and that essentially means applying a lot of brute force, working intense hours and working a lot of hours. In light of that, I was curious to know, what were the early days of Orange Digital, and then Askable like? Like, what are some of the realities of entrepreneurship that perhaps aren't as glamorous? They don't make for great Instagram captions and don't receive as much time in the limelight.
Yeah, I've probably come up with 100. There's so many things, yeah, because before you've reached that scale or before you even have you can afford to do things, you just got to do stuff yourself, right? Early days Orange, I mean, there were times when me and John were literally painting our office ourselves, right? We were up to like 10 p.m. painting the office. There was one time where we'd landed out one of our biggest deals at that time, and they were going to come in and visit the office, and our office was pretty. It was a pretty basic house out at Newmarket that had been converted into an office, and so that day we were scrambling. We went to IKEA and like bought plants and stuff to put around the office. We went and found this giant like plastic board thing, and John manually carved our logo into the sign and hung it up. And I remember as the customer walked out, and they were really impressed, they walked out, the sign fell off because we'd blue tacked it to the wall, right?
That's hilarious.
But, you know, and same with Askable, right? So at the beginning, I remember vividly sitting on the floor outside our office in the Valley, calling everyone I knew who was a mum with kids, because we had a booking come through and they'd asked to do a focus group for mums with kids. And so I was just going through everyone I knew, ringing them, manually calling them, going, hey, we got this thing next week, you know, would you be interested in coming along? And then the lady in the office next door would come out and be like, shut up, you know. But that's just stuff that you got to do, right? Like if you really want to get it off the ground, you just got to be willing to get your hands dirty with that stuff. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah. If someone's wanting to dive a little deeper on all the things we were just talking about, you know, business, entrepreneurship, startups, what are some really awesome resources you'd recommend looking into?
Yeah, so the Y Combinator series, so they've made a lot of this stuff free, pretty much all their stuff free, I think. They even have kind of like courses, like online courses that you can enroll in. So I recommend starting there because they've got a lot of great material. And then I guess, I mean, again, it's going to depend on exactly what you're working on, but I'd highly recommend trying to reach out to people who've sort of a bit further ahead on the journey in the kind of specific industry that you're in. My advice to people would be, you'd be surprised how willing people are to help. You know, if you're just starting out on the journey and you reach out to these people and say, hey, I'm stuck with this thing, or I'm a bit lost with this thing. Yeah, I think the general consensus is you'd be amazed at how willing these people are to actually reply to you and help you.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, I'd recommend doing that as well.
Before we get to the last question, where can people find you on social and Askable as well, if you'd like to plug that?
So I don't really Instagram anymore. A lot of my stuff is pretty old now, but definitely you can follow my Medium blog. And we're actually just putting together a new blog on Askable as well. So,
awesome.
So definitely check that out in the coming weeks. Yeah.
Sweet. Last question. I know you're familiar with Peter Thiel and have read 0 to 1, which is also one of my favorite business books. So I thought I'd ask, what is something contrarian you've adhered to in your career, or perhaps held true that, you know, that other people would disagree with, think is bad advice, think is foolish? Like, what counterintuitive insight should more people be taking a second look at or thinking about a bit more deeply?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so I'd have a bunch, but I think one of the big ones that sort of took me a really long time to realize was that kind of not all businesses were made equal. There are some businesses that are simply, in terms of the business structure itself, better than other businesses for a multitude of reasons. But you know, so just because you have a business and that business that may even be going well, doesn't mean it's actually the best type of business. I think the classic one is restaurants, right? Like, and restaurants receive a bad rap, and probably rightly so, for being the types of business that are notoriously difficult to be successful in. So I think restaurants is a good example of that. but there are probably hundreds of other types of businesses out there that would probably fall in line in a similar bucket as kind of the restaurant business, but don't receive the same kind of like negative reputation that they do. And so it's, I guess my contrarian belief there would be that not all business models are actually equal. So just because you've got a business and yes, it may be running, it doesn't mean that business is as good as it could be.
I love that.
Yeah.
Man, thanks so much for coming on the show, brother.
No worries.